I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as video evidence emerges of North Korean troops in combat, in a special episode, we hear a report David Knowles recorded before his death, which looks deeper into the question of Pyongyang's early involvement in this war, and later hear about the charity we're fundraising for in David's memory.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 16th of December, 2 years and 302 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and narrative podcast producer and David's partner, Adélie Pojzman-Pontay. But first to Dom for news from the front lines.
So let's try and go back over the weekend in some sort of chronological order. So Saturday, Russia has been using North Korean troops in significant numbers for the first time to conduct assaults on Ukrainian forces battling to hold territory in Russia's Kursk region, according to President Zelensky. Speaking on Saturday, he said, "Today, we already have preliminary data that the Russians have begun to use North Korean soldiers in their assaults, a significant number of them." Now, he confirmed uncorroborated reports that we've been relating for a while now by adding that North Korean soldiers are being incorporated into Russian units rather than working completely separately, and only on the Kursk front to now. But he did say, quote, "We have information suggesting their use could extend to other parts of the front line." Now, North Korean forces are thought to already be taking, significant and noticeable forces. Footage released over the weekend on Telegram and Twitter, probably elsewhere as well, you'll be able to find it, showing North Korean soldiers being massacred after assaulting Ukrainian positions in straight lines. They're all bunching up. They're not showing any kind of tactics other than the meat assaults that we've seen before. The images then showed a long row of allegedly dead North Korean soldiers lined up in the snow. Now, President Zelensky's comments were then backed up on Sunday when, in an interview with CBS News, Ukraine's ambassador to the US, Oksana Markarova, said that hundreds of North Korean troops are fighting alongside Russian troops in Kursk. And she said, "We've seen hundreds on the battlefield already, and Ukraine is successfully fighting them as we are fighting with the Russians. We see them now in Kursk Oblast only, and our brave defenders were not only able to kill a lot of them, but also keep their positions." Now, the Kyiv Independent are reporting today that Ukraine's military intelligence say that 30 North Korean troops were killed over the weekend, probably in that assault that you'll find on social media. Now, a segment later from Adélie, that Adélie did with David, will be coming up. It's going to look into more detail into North Korean weapons being provided to Russian forces. Now, also on Saturday, it appears Ukraine took action to counter the build-up of Russian forces in the Zaporizhia area, where it's thought Russia will attempt another push in the coming weeks. So on Saturday, a Russian train carrying 40 fuel tanks was destroyed. It's thought by a HIMARS strike, following action by saboteurs to destroy tracks near the village of that's in the Bilmak district. So that halted the train, and then the HIMARS strike destroyed the train. This area is about 50 km north of Berdyansk. Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, they're reporting today that Russian forces elsewhere along the front conducted a three-pronged mechanized assault with over 400 personnel, up to 30 armoured vehicles, 60 motorcycles to northeast and south of Siversk, basically, also on Saturday. So Siversk up in the sort of northern Donbass area. Now, we think that some of those forces achieved some measure of a break-in into Ukrainian positions, especially to the south of Siversk, but most seem to have eventually been pushed back, although it's very confusing. It's likely, based on the reporting I've seen, likely that Russia has advanced in some areas. So I can't say it was completely repulsed with no advances. They may well have taken a few hundred meters off ground, but it's very difficult to tell. But no significant movement in the Siversk area. Now, the Ukrainian Luhansk Group of Forces spokesperson, Major Anastasia Bobnikova, said that Russian forces had fielded more than 100 pieces of equipment in a recent assault in the Siversk area. And she said that there were 55 combat engagements in that area on Friday alone. ISW saying that is a significant increase in the tempo in that area of the front line. Now then, on to Sunday. Overnight, Saturday to Sunday, Russia launched 108 drones at Ukraine from the Russian regions of Kursk, Orel, Bryansk and Milorovo. Ukrainian military say they shot down 56. 49 were brought down by EW and 3 went back towards Russia or Belarus. I can see a few injuries, a mercifully small number of injuries. Can't see any deaths reported from that. However, there were reports over the weekend, backed up in today's ISW report, that says that Ukraine's intelligence directorate were reporting on Saturday that the North Korean forces in Kursk Oblast killed 8 Chechen Akhmat Spetsnaz battalion personnel in what for Russia is a friendly fire incident. Now, they're saying this was likely due to the language barrier between Russian and North Korean forces, and they follow it up by quoting a source from the Ukrainian military intelligence as saying that language barrier is hindering effective coordination between the two forces. Always tricky. Do you bring them in? Does Russia try and bring the North Korean troops in as part of their forces, totally integrate them, or have them completely separate? It's a tricky one, which they've not been able to work out yet. Then on Saturday, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov's weekend didn't improve, having supposedly lost those people in a friendly force incident. Weekend didn't improve when Ukraine attacked the capital of Chechnya on Sunday. Locals reporting there that 3 drones targeted military and police bases. Now, Kadyrov's people say that 2 were shot down, but a 3rd hit the Akhmat Grozny base, which reportedly houses units of his private army. There's footage posted on Russian Telegram channels that shows a drone, pretty much, I reckon it's an A-22 Foxbat. Have a look at H. Sutton's brilliant website, Covert Shores, for a good graphic of what we know about Ukrainian autonomous drones, basically. So I think it's an A-22 Foxbat. It hurtles into a building in Grozny, in the capital, and then there's a massive explosion. There's a lot of gunfire just in the run-up to that, which indicates, A, that they can't hit it. I don't know how far away they were, to be fair, but nothing seems to hit the aircraft. But also, there's no air defense missiles in Grozny for poor old Mr. Kadyrov, who apparently is one of Putin's favorites, but he doesn't get the air defense. Now then, posts on the Chechen Telegram channel said that the attacks had targeted key facilities. There was a lot of speculation if it was a riot police base. It was at one point suggested it was the 2nd Regiment of the Chechen Interior Ministry's Patrol and Guard Service. And then finally, it was thought to be a military base linked to Russia's war effort, but something was definitely hit. Now, Kadyrov said there's no casualties have been reported, and he said he would respond with, quote, more precise and harsher retaliatory strikes, although he failed to mention that this was the 3rd such attack this month in the region, and he's yet to respond to any of it. It's always very easy puffing out one's chest and saying, you can do this, you can do that, and then not actually follow through on your word. Then up to date today, Ukrainian drones successfully attacked a Russian ammunition depot near the occupied Silyev-Mokhin in Donetsk Oblast a few days ago. So that's been reported today, but apparently it happened a few days ago. This is a source for Ukraine Security Service, the SBU, speaking to Kyiv Independent. Kyiv Independent reporting it this morning. That's why I included it under today. I told you the chronology was going to be tricky. Anyway, the source said that the depot contained thousands of ammunition rounds for armoured personnel, carriers, tanks, anti-tank guided missiles, mines, grenades, and millions of rounds of ammunition of various caliber. A nearby fuel and lubricants depot is also thought to have been destroyed. The footage online shows a very large, nicely symmetrical explosion, lovely big round ball of flame in the sky, nice little mushroom cloud that happened through the night, none of which is independently verified yet. However, sticking on drones, Ukrainska Pravda are reporting today that almost 100 of Ukraine's new so-called Peklo missile drone hybrids have been produced and that the weapon has entered serial production. Now, some details of the Peklo's capabilities remain undisclosed for security reasons, but you'll remember this is the thing that President Zelensky said. He said the weapon was a fundamentally new type of weapon. We think it's a mix of drone and missile capabilities, particularly in the engine. It functions as a long-range drone, but has a jet engine and a more advanced guidance system. Ukrainska Pravda saying that it has a range of 700 kilometers and a speed of 700 kilometers an hour. So even my maths can work out that it can get to its maximum range in about a couple of hours. Now, officials reportedly said that system has already been deployed by Ukraine. I mention that because you're going to hear a lot more from Russia about this Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile that they want us to keep calling an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was a bodge job of various experimental parts that they put together to fire the first one. There'll probably be one or two more that they can put together off the shelf. There's a vast difference between getting a load of kit, bolting it together and firing it, even if it is effective. That's different to having a serial production. So just next time, and we're bound to hear it in the next few days about the Oreshnik, I reckon, just bear that one in mind when we talk about what is a capability, as in you've got a serial production line and you can roll these things off, you've got a plan for it, and what is just a bit of kit that you can bodge together and then light the blue touch paper. Now, just finishing off, last night, Ukrainian air defences shot down 27 of 49 drones launched by Russia. This comes from Ukraine's Air Force. 19 others were reportedly lost to EW. There's no data on the final 3. No deaths reported, and thankfully only 6 injuries spread over Kharkiv, Kherson, and Mykolaiv oblasts. Otherwise, very small advances on the ground over the weekend, mostly by Russia and mostly south of Kursk, although a little bit of push and pulling elsewhere. No change in the Kursk area. So Ukrainian forces still not pushed out of that lodgement in the Kursk area. And just to finish off, Francis, today's ISW report, noting that obviously they're based at the East Coast US, their data cutoff point is about midday their time, Eastern time. That's around 7 p.m. In Ukraine. So that was their data cutoff point. But they're reporting a Russian source saying that Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, so the SVR, the overseas, a kind of CIA, MI6 equivalent, if you like, very rough equivalent, the director there, Sergei Naryshkin, may have fallen out of Putin's favour following the Assad regime's collapse in Syria. They're saying that Putin was reportedly planning to issue Naryshkin with a state award, but that decree has been rescinded. So that was reported by ASW quite late in Ukraine and Russia time yesterday. We'll keep an eye out for more updates on that. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Since you ended with Syria, I'll start there. One, of course, of the key questions since the collapse of the Assad regime is the degree to which this means the end of Russian influence over that country and whether or not it will lose its naval bases. Well, if we look at the facts, Russia evacuated at least 400 soldiers from the Damascus region in recent days in coordination with the main rebel faction that toppled Assad's regime. An official from the new group said, speaking to the Financial Times, the soldiers had been stationed at the Syrian army's notorious 4th Division headquarters on the outskirts of the capital. Apparently, conversations are ongoing to evacuate more soldiers across the country, and Moscow's key vessels have already pulled out of the ports, as we reported last week. So it would appear that, indeed, the Kremlin is being obliged to scale back its presence, which would hardly be surprising, since it was their armed forces that propped up this tyrannical regime that's just been overthrown. But it is significant, I would say, that a dialogue has been opened between the new government, if we can call it that yet, and the Kremlin. There hasn't been fighting between the two sides, as some speculated. Syria is the lead subject of the first Foreign Affairs Council. That's the EU's external arm, led by, of course, the new head of its foreign affairs and security policy, former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. Now, long-time listeners will know just how clear-eyed Kallas is on Russia particularly, and how robust her statements have been regarding what is required, in her view, to defeat it in Ukraine. And in her remarks to the press this morning, clearly very happy to be in post and acting at last, she referenced both Ukraine and Georgia as being the other two core subjects of the conversation after Syria. And I imagine if our very own Joan Barnes wasn't watching it, he may have been there in person. She also announced the latest sanctions package. That's the 15th by the EU, which includes more forceful action against companies in Serbia, Iran, the UAE, China and India that violate sanctions against Russia. This is an attempt to try and stop the third parties that we've been talking about so often in recent months, and in a sense how they're circumnavigating the sanctions, utilising those. Now, the sanctions, Kallas said, includes the Shadow Fleet and the North Korean officials and Chinese businessmen who are enabling this war. As you say, there'll be more on North Korea very shortly. But that reference to the shadow fleet is interesting, as there was some dramatic footage over the weekend of 2 Russian oil tankers wrecked in rough seas off Moscow-annexed Crimea, with one spilling oil into the Kursk Strait. At least one person was killed when the decades-old 136-metre tanker with 15 people on board split in half with its bow sinking, with waves washing over its deck. It's extremely visually striking footage, so we say. Now, many analysts are reading into this the fact that Russian merchant fleet is poorly maintained, and this may be evidence of ships being pulled out of retirement in order to serve in that so-called shadow fleet. One of the boats was built in 1973, so it's over 50 years old now. Now, the EU package also includes firmer protection against Russian litigation against European companies, which matters because of the legal challenges companies with subsidiaries in Russia still face, and loopholes in access to Western legal services that Kremlin-aligned Russians have been able to exploit. Now, just staying briefly on sanctions, there were reports over the weekend that President Biden virtually met with G7 leaders and encouraged them to unlock the full value of immobilized Russian sovereign assets, including by finding a legal pathway to seize the principal value of the assets to provide Ukraine with the resources it needs. That would, of course, mark a significant shift in how the seized Russian assets have been used for so far, and if it happens, could be, some believe, a game changer. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that too. But just lastly, remaining on the US, an interesting story in our paper is that Ukraine has delayed signing a critical minerals agreement with the US, reportedly to allow President-elect Donald Trump to claim credit when he takes office and hopefully secure his backing during the negotiation talks widely expected early next year. If so, it's the kind of canny move we've come to expect from the Ukrainians, speaking to Trump's love of doing deals. But the key question remains, is it possible to resolve every matter with a handshake? So that's the latest in the military and political spheres. But now we are delighted to be sharing the airwaves with narrative podcast producer and David's partner, Adélie Pojzman-Pontay. Adélie, this is a long time coming. Listeners will already be familiar with your work, most recently from Friday's episode, where we played some of the recordings you made in Kharkiv. But this will be the first time they've actually heard your voice. So welcome. So the reason you're joining us today is twofold, really. The first is to spill the beans of one of the major reasons we were in Kharkiv that we haven't shared yet. And the second is to talk about an episode you recorded with David, which those at home will hear in today's episode. But before we get into all that, perhaps you can just share a little bit about your background and your work. I know people will be very curious.
Thanks, Francis. So, yes, I've been at the Telegraph for 2 years. I'm a narrative podcast producer. It's a bit of a fancy title, but what that basically means is that I work on any project that's more of a documentary style rather than a live conversation and interview show like what we do here. When I joined the Telegraph 2 years ago, I started working with David on the recordings he'd done in Ukraine by himself. Let me tell you, David did not know how to use a mic and recorder at that point. A lot of these recordings were absolutely unusable. But we got there eventually. That's when he went to Bucha a few months after the occupation, or a few months later when he went to Kramatorsk with the 8th convoy. So I worked with him behind the scenes to put these episodes together that you may have listened to. Last winter, David skipped over to my desk, as he always did, with a smile on his face and twinkling eyes. He was not going to share a fun fact about Russian city flags or Napoleon. As you've probably heard, I am French, so he often did share facts about Napoleon, and so do you, Francis. But he asked whether I'd be interested in joining the team to go to Ukraine on a reporting trip. He wanted us to do more reported and narrative content for the show, and I was really excited about it. That sounded really, really cool. So we went there in February for the 2nd year anniversary of the full-scale invasion. We spent 2 weeks recording loads of interviews for several different projects. We worked hand in hand in Ukraine and afterwards, and it wasn't long before David and I were holding hands outside of work too. When you listen to the show, the work of producers is invisible, and that's how it should be. Producing is a bit like ballet, something I'm sure you're very familiar with, Francis.
No comment.
You shouldn't see the effort that goes into it, and you shouldn't see the producing. But behind the scenes, it's very much a two-person effort. And David and I worked really, really well together. We decided on interviews together. We prepped them together. I would record and direct him, asking him to rephrase a question or a description when we're in the field. And then we built the structure and the script of each episode together. From that trip in February, you may have heard our episode in Hostomel or Bucha and the one in the school in Staropetrovsky. There's still more that's saved on my computer. There was more to come when David died. And now that I'm back into the office after taking a bit of a break for a few weeks, I'll be continuing that work and making sure it gets to your ears. That's what David would want.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for that overview, Adélie. So let's turn to Kharkiv then. It was a city David was very keen to visit, as were you, earlier this year. But for various reasons, not least security, it couldn't happen. But perhaps you can just share with listeners how together we were able to make it happen last month.
Yes, when we were planning the trip in February with David, we had originally planned to do 1 week in Kyiv, 1 week in Kharkiv. But the situation became really dangerous out there just a few weeks when we were getting the green light from management. And we were told, no, there was no trip going to Kharkiv in February 2024. So we stayed in Kyiv and surroundings for 2 weeks. But David, unbeknownst to him, he did make it happen. Before he died, he had suggested that one of the charities that the Telegraph should support and raise money for Christmas should operate near the frontline in Ukraine. And so he actually pitched Humanity and Inclusion, I think, to management a week or 10 days before he died. That was just right before. So Humanity and Inclusion, it is a charity that works near the front lines in all sorts of countries around the world, but specifically in Ukraine, which is what we're raising money for. They help disabled and vulnerable people in situations of conflict and disaster, helping them evacuate, get access to drugs, medical services, social services, and helping them live if they cannot evacuate where they are. It was founded in France in the 1980s. David was fluent in French, and he liked all things French, including me, so he would have liked that.
Well, thanks, Adélie. As you say, there's so much content to come out of the work with Humanity Inclusion that we did out there, and we're going to be raising awareness and money for them over the coming weeks. But for those who wish to be first out of the gate and donate in David's memory, there will be a link in the episode description. And I should add that David helped us out there in another way too, further to making the trip happen in the first place. Long needing some new walking boots after mine fell apart on a mountain, story for another day, I was able to borrow his for the trip to Ukraine. So a part of him did make it to Kharkiv. But Adélie, turning to today's episode, listeners will hear David's voice again, followed by your own. Can you tell us about the subject?
Yes, absolutely. So last February, we went to a special institute in Kyiv where they dissect remnants of missiles, drones, and other weapons that have been fired at Ukraine. It's like a graveyard of blown up and rusted metal. And so you'll hear us visiting this and seeing that as we're talking to the experts of the Institute. For me, that was the first time that I ever saw a missile, a rocket or a drone in real life, but especially this close up. We could literally touch them. It made all of these videos of explosions and hits that I'd seen over the years very, very, very real. Being able to feel how sharp the shrapnel was, to see how big the missiles were, was completely sobering for both David and I. I don't think he'd ever seen anything like that either. We were quite baffled when we got there by the amount of just military equipment and the amount of weapons we were able to see. In the episode, you'll hear from two people, Christina and Alexander. We're not sharing their last names for obvious security reasons. Christina is an investigator with Conflict Armament Research. That's an organization that you'll hear more about in the piece. They track whether sanctions against Russia work. And Alexander is a scientist who works more on the tech side that's found inside the weapons. It so happens that when we visited, a team of scientists and investigators had just received the first remnants of North Korean missiles. I'm not actually sure whether David knew about this ahead of our visit, because we'd been planning it for some weeks then. But right there and then, when they showed us the Korean signs on these metal casings, it was very clear that this was going to be a major part of the story.
Absolutely. And as ever, whether he was aware of it or not, David was ahead of the curve, focusing on the impact of North Korean involvement long before it was widely known. And indeed, it's still now a major, major story, as we've been reporting today. So we'll be hearing that episode in a moment. But just before we leave listeners to that, perhaps you can just share a few reflections on these, well, horrible few months, Adélie, to be honest. I know many listeners have reached out to you, and I'm sure they'd love to hear your thoughts.
Obviously, David's death was a massive shock, and so many people have reached out to us on the Telegraph website, by email, on Twitter, to you guys, to us, the team, to David's family, his parents and brother Andrew. It's been very overwhelming as well as heartwarming to see how much David was loved in these last few weeks. And obviously I knew about the numbers of the podcast. I knew about his work. I saw it every day. David, as we've often said, was very humble and had no ego. So he didn't really, although we knew the numbers and we knew how important the podcast was, but we didn't quite imagine the sort of effect he had on people and how much he was loved by people far and wide around the world. Some of you have also been very, very kind to reach out to me personally. I've received several cards and emails and letters. I've not managed to reply to most of them yet. Forgive me, that will have to wait for 2025 once we're a bit out of the woods. But it's been incredibly touching to find this support from people I didn't know and who had barely heard about me because my name and my voice never makes it to the podcast. It's been a weird space to be in, being both David's colleague as well as his girlfriend, also because we were not really out in the office. So it was a whole process of finding out of his death, people finding out about us at the same time. David and I were very much planning our life together, and I'll forever regret that I was never able to become his wife, and that will never be the Pojzman-Knowles, as he had suggested actually, that we should be called. We used to joke that the credits to the podcast would become incredibly boring because you'd have David Pojzman-Knowles and Adélie Pojzman-Knowles at the end of each episode. Anyways, everyone who has loved David and still does, from far away, unbeknownst to him, or very close, his family, his friends, Dom, Francis, have been incredibly supportive surrounding me in the last few weeks, and it's been incredible to be able to stand all there together despite everything that's happened. It's helped me find it within me to come back into the office. David's desk is just 2 desks away from mine, and to carry on David's work. And I especially want to thank Dom and Francis. Thank you, boys, you've been absolutely incredible these past weeks, and for inviting me in front of the mic today and for in the future with you. It's a huge honour to be here and to do this work with you both.
Well, thank you, Adélie. The honour is ours. Dom, before we let David and Adélie take over the rest of the episode, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Adélie, delighted you are here. I think you've been hanging around Brits a bit longer than you expected. When you say that you and David weren't really known in the office as an item, that is a little bit of British understatement, I might suggest, because it turns out all the women knew. Francis and I didn't have a clue. Not a sausage. Didn't know what was going on. Complete news to us, but apparently all asking Louisa and Gemma and all the others, they all knew. But we are delighted that you are with us. So looking forward to working with you closer, more involved in the pod. I'm glad that you're going to be lending a bit of sense and decorum to what would otherwise be an unseemly brawl. But no, I'm delighted you are here. It's been such a horrible few months, and we'll keep going together. But there's a new sheriff in town.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I'll make sure the boys are well behaved, that's for sure.
On a bright sunny day in February 2024, I'm in the courtyard of a big government building in Kyiv. It's almost a huge scrapyard of military equipment. On our way in, we noticed that the connection for our phones was getting dodgy and faulty. We thought it was just, some little glitch, but we come to somewhere really, really sensitive for the Ukrainian government. This compound is a high-security laboratory.
Alexander is the expert of this institute.
Crucial to the Ukrainian war effort.
Nice to meet you. David.
Alexander.
The courtyard is small, with long porta cabins running along each side. All around me, there are several big missiles, with the fins pointing out. They're at least sort of 4 or 5 meters long. Shell casings, mines, rocket casings, anti-tank guided missiles. It's almost like we're looking at a museum exhibit here. Above our heads, there's a particularly impressive piece in the collection. An entire Shahed drone. Imagine a sort of squash version of Concorde, like a triangle that flies. When these weapons are shot out of the sky or disabled, they're sent to special sites to be taken apart by Ukrainian scientists, like Christina and Alexander. Discovering how they work is a top priority for Kyiv. Amongst the collection, Christina points out several large pieces of a missile near the entrance.
KN-23 or KN-24.
It's rusted with a few holes in it. There's not much of it. It's quite big, and there's another piece down there. They are blackened by fire, and you can just about make out some writing on the casing.
Which numbers in black color.
But what is it? Why is it important?
So these are remnants of a possible North Korean missile.
You got that right. A possible North Korean missile.
It was shot down in Kiev in January by air defense forces.
This is one of the first ever North Korean missiles to be spotted in Ukraine. Both countries, Russia and North Korea, are hit with international sanctions that are supposed to hobble their arms industry. And yet, they have access to components that allow them to build, trade, and fire deadly weapons. The problem, then, is this. These missile parts don't just come from hostile states such as North Korea. Most of the components actually come from the West. So who's involved? How do these components get to Russia? And can it be stopped? It's a puzzle that the Ukrainian authorities, as well as Christina and Alexander, are racing to piece together as they fight to hold back Moscow's armies. I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. It's hard to comprehend that this small, inconspicuous scrapyard can be such an important part of Ukraine's war effort. And yet, a few days before I visited, the work Christina and Alexander do came up in a fancy hotel at the very centre of Kyiv, where President Volodymyr Zelensky gave a press conference in front of the world's media on the anniversary of Ukraine's invasion. Just outside the room where Zelensky spoke to the world's media, a couple of Ukrainian soldiers point to an exhibition table covered with electronic plates.
Combat helicopter.
They're grey and green, studded with microchips and surrounded by tangled wires.
High-level measuring.
That's exactly what Christina and Alexander study in their laboratory, the electronic components found in Russia's missiles.
In Russian weapon, we have 67% of United States elements.
And that's exactly what the Ukrainian government want journalists from these very countries present at the press conference to pay attention to.
Texas Instruments, United States. Altera, United States. Xilinx, United States. Sierra, United
Despite
States.
3 years of international sanctions, for the Ukrainians, far too much Western tech is ending up in the weapons of their enemies.
American, Taiwanian, Japanese, Great Britain, Switzerland.
Is there anything you don't find? A few days later at the scrapyard, I point to the Shahed drone hanging above our heads. There's some writing scribbled on the side.
Yura Bison.
Oh, that's a name.
Yura, this is the name for Yura Bison.
That's Ihor. He's our translator on this tour, and you'll hear him throughout the interview.
And Bison, this is the call sign of this soldier who supposedly died in the war. I believe that they are trying to repay for death of this Yura or something like this.
Is that normal to see stuff like that written on missiles?
So they write some derogatory things to insult Ukrainians.
So can you tell us what are the first things you're looking for when you're examining this? What are you trying to find and how do you do that?
So the first thing that we're looking at is what kind of weapon it actually is, and what was the direction that it was launched from, and what destruction it caused. So we try to figure out what kind of micro elements were used within them, and also cooperate with other institutes to understand how to counter these kinds of weapons that are used against Ukraine.
Once Christina and Alexander have analysed the missiles, they get shipped to different law enforcement agencies.
Some parts of the debris can be used as evidence of war crimes. Some of the missile remnants can be used for reparations or sanctions. For instance, this information can be used for the reimbursement by Russia.
Christina and Alexander take us inside one of the long porta cabins. On the shelves, there's a Shahid drone, just like the one we saw on our way in. This one is in pieces. The scientists have taken it apart. Christina shows me how they identify the microchips inside the drones and how they find out where they're from and which company makes them. That's the first step to understanding how countries bypass sanctions. Alexander and Christina have very kindly opened up the brain of the drone. It's a sort of small square, it's quite heavy.
And screws might be not in the straight shape, and that is why it's really difficult to disassemble some components.
Do you see any foreign components here already?
Yeah, I see it. After I document it, we'll investigate them. That is why we never name manufacturers publicly, because all this process needs investigation.
What are you looking for, Christina?
I'm looking for markings and whether they were obliterated, because sometimes we see obliterated chips, so we cannot identify manufacturer, lot, batch number, and date of manufacture.
When you say obliterated, you mean they've scratched out the name, so we don't know where it comes from?
Yeah. Okay. But we also document this stuff to show that they are doing this.
So they're deliberately, they know what you're trying to do, essentially.
Yeah.
And they're trying to get one step ahead by making sure you can't trace it. It feels like it's a bit of an arms race between you, the investigators, and the drone manufacturers.
Yeah, yes, that's true. And we were extremely happy to document electronic components from the North Korean missile. Yeah, because we saw a lot of interesting stuff there.
The work Christina and Alexander do is the first step of a long process.
When you look at it, it's just a pile of, scrap metal, tangled wires and things like that protruding. So we needed to make sense of it.
Damien Spleeters is a director at Conflict Armament Research. It's an organisation that tracks and identifies weapons and ammunition in conflicts around the world. He worked to identify the North Korean missile.
Our hypothesis was that it was, for the first time, a North Korean missile being used by Russia on Ukraine. But we needed to find enough evidence to prove that. And we did.
Damien explains that the scraps of metal the team had recovered looked strangely like a type of Russian missile that's often fired towards Ukraine. But small differences gave it away.
The first thing that we noticed was that the diameter of the rocket motor was different, slightly bigger. So that was kind of a telltale characteristic.
Inside the missile, they found more evidence.
The label with a Korean character. And then we found several marks on different components that started with 112. It is a reference to the official North Korean calendar, which would correspond to 2023.
Damien, Christina, Alexander, and the rest of the team soon realised they were dealing with something really important.
It's very significant, in our opinion, because it questions the efficacy of UN sanctions to stop them from progressing in their weapon program and their missile program. It's even worse than you think, because after that, we got access to components from another missile.
That second missile is the one Christina was pointing to in the scrapyard in Kiev.
We documented 280 electronic components and found that, all of them were either from the US the EU, and Asia. And 80% of the components for which we could identify a date of production, which is about half of them, were manufactured between 2021 and 2023.
What that means is that the missile could not have been assembled before the components were produced.
So North Korea was able to produce those missiles, quite quickly in 2023, and then pass them on to Russia also fairly quickly. And then Russia used them in January of 2024 on Kiev. So the window of production, despite all these sanctions, is very short.
Understanding how foreign components make their way into North Korean, Russian, or Iranian weapons is an important challenge for Ukraine and her allies.
This is not a surprise to us that North Korea is using commercial components in their weapons. Russia is doing the same, Iran is doing the same.
And so it begs the question, how do these countries still access foreign electronic components? And are these sanctions really working?
We are doing a lot of work to try to change the mentality from big producers, which is at the moment that components that are produced in trillions of units every year, very little unique markings on them, are virtually impossible to trace. And what we've proven over the last 2 years is that this is false. We have identified problematic distributors. Some have been listed, some have been sanctioned as a result of our work. It's both a curse and a blessing. The curse is that we keep on seeing Western components in missiles used against interests of Western countries. The blessing is that there's something you can do about it.
At the other end of the investigation, Damien Spleeters makes sure these findings help manufacturers identify dodgy customers who might be trafficking microchips into Russia.
It is possible to trace it. We have done it. And the most impactful thing is when we convince a producer that it's possible to do that, and then they come back to us and say, look, we've got a new customer. They're not listed, they're not sanctioned, but they are requesting this very same model that you have found in the Russian drone. Can you tell us something about it? And very recently, we just found one that, they happen to be a company based in China that is actually feeding a Russian sanctioned company, after they've been sanctioned, millions of dollars of components. And they're not yet sanctioned, not yet listed.
Keeping track of all the distributors is a bit like playing whack-a-mole. There's always a new company, a new path created to avoid sanctions.
It takes time, and it also needs a lot of fine-tuning. And you have to, plug those little holes that keep coming. It's a lot of old-fashioned investigation where you need to kneel down in the dirt, quite literally for hours, and start looking for clues and then piecing everything together. And the impact that it has is tremendous. When we see people getting arrested, companies getting sanctioned, and companies getting listed, and then industry members coming to us and saying, can you help us? And we can. We literally can help them make a huge difference. It's priceless.
There are many fronts in Russia's war on Ukraine. One of the most consequential to the millions of Ukrainian civilians is the missile and drone strikes that Russia launches almost daily for more than 2 years across the entire country. These attacks have destroyed infrastructure, killed thousands of civilians, and forced many to leave their homes forever. In the spring and summer of 2024, Russia targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure and, due to a lack of air defense and overwhelming numbers of missiles and drones, managed to score some devastating hits. Now, Ukrainians are in a race against time to repair and prepare for a winter ravaged by electricity blackouts. Surviving a heat wave in the summer without air conditioning is tough. A Ukrainian winter without heating will be deadly. These strikes are only possible thanks to the Western components in the missiles and drones that, despite sanctions, continue to make their way to Russia. The fighting that usually makes the news is at the front lines. It's dominated by drones, tanks, and artillery. But this arms race, fought by scientists and investigators in secret laboratories, is just as important for the outcome of the war.
The segment you just heard was almost ready to air when David passed at the beginning of September. I say almost ready because David and I had just realised there was one incredibly misleading section in our episode. We had relayed something of an urban legend when it comes to how electronic chips make their way into Russia. What we had understood is this: that Central Asian states were exporting an enormous amount of household appliances, like fridges and washing machines, to Russia. There, they were stripped of their electronic components, which were then used to make weapons. Well, it turns out that is absolutely not what happens. That's what Damien Spleeters from Conflict Armament Research told us in an email. So please, forget what I just told you. When I came back to work a few weeks ago and decided I would finish the work David and I had started together, I wanted to chat with Damien again. I wanted to understand where that legend comes from, how the chips actually make it into Russia, and how these missiles fit in the context of North Korea sending troops to Ukraine in the last few weeks. Here's our conversation. So Damien, we last spoke to you several months ago after we'd come back from our trip with David in Ukraine. You were in the process of documenting and investigating the first 2 remnants of North Korean missiles that had been found in Ukraine. There have been more found over the summer and over the last months that you also have continued to document and investigate. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So over the summer in August and September, we got access to additional missile remnants. We were able to, again, attribute them to North Korea. And then this time, we documented the presence of a 113 mark, which indicates production in 2024. So it's important for us because it shows several things. The first thing is that it was just not one transfer of North Korean missiles, but it's ongoing. And 2, it shows that the window between production, transfer, and use is actually pretty short, pretty tight. So the supply chain is also pretty tensed in that sense. It's kind of made to order and being used almost immediately after transfer and production, just a matter of a few months. We also were able to document some of the components inside the missile. Some of them were marked with a production year of 2023, which keeps on supporting the fact that they were made very recently.
Can we infer from that North Korea is ramping up production of missiles and there's an ongoing path for North Korea to provide Russia with more missiles as it's ramping up its presence in the conflict as well?
Yeah, it's very difficult for us to estimate quantities because it's a very opportunistic type of documentation. We only get access to what's being recovered, what's being shut down, etc. So it's very difficult to infer quantities. But again, what we can say is that it's ongoing. There were missiles produced last year that were fired and recovered in Ukraine earlier this year. And then there were missiles produced this year that were fired and then recovered just within a few months of being produced.
And so do you expect that we'll continue finding more remnants of North Korean missiles in the future?
Unfortunately, yes. It seems that everything is being fired nowadays, and it looks like they are supplementing current stockpiles that are being fired at Ukraine. So I expect that we will continue to find them. And therefore, we want to work with industry.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you know about the supply chain that gets the chips to North Korea then?
Well, essentially now it's a bit early, but it looks like the trends are the same as what we've found for Iranian and Russian weapons. So it goes through a certain number of layers of intermediaries. Some are based in third countries in Asia, and the diversion happens there, where the manufacturer has less visibility and less control over their own supply chain going downwards.
Can you give me a very concrete example? Because
you have a manufacturer selling components to a regional distributor. Mm-hmm. That regional distributor will then in turn sell it to a freight forwarder, a local distributor, which will then sell it to a reported end user, which is probably the entity that will divert it. So that's where we come in. We get responses from different manufacturers identifying the same entities We triangulate that to see which entity is common to them all. Manufacturers by themselves will not be able to identify one company among the dozens that are the reported end users. But when we compile all the information that we receive doing the tracing work that we do with industry, we are able then to identify those potential diverters and report that information to policymakers, law enforcement, and industry themselves.
What you call the end users, that would be companies set up by North Korea, let's say, that tries to buy and get their hands on chips. Is that correct?
Yeah, except in those cases that we found, the companies identified are not set up by North Korean individuals or North Korea itself. They are big, publicly traded companies based in Asian countries that are, as far as we can see, the reported end users, the final company that is reported to have had the chip in their possession.
Okay, and then these guys...
Something happens there.
Something happens there. We don't know what, we don't know how. Is this where the washing machines come in? Or
the washing machines never come in.
Okay, what is that urban legend and how has it come up? Because it seems like that is everybody's understanding of how the chips get diverted.
Well, correlation is not causation. It's not because 10 times more washing machines go to Kazakhstan or Russia that Russia takes the chips from the washing machines and puts them in missile. It doesn't happen. They just buy semiconductors. They buy components. They don't buy a $500 washing machine to take a $1 part and put it in a missile. It's not what's happening. What I think happened, and I say this all the time, it should be the subject of a PhD in semantics. Someone came in and said, the Russians are using washing machine parts in their missiles. And what they meant was some of the components that we find in missiles are also, components that can be used in household appliances. It does not mean that the components from household appliances are put in missiles, right? It does not make sense to buy a $500 washing machines for a $1 part that you can otherwise just buy in large quantities for a fraction of that price, which is what Russia is doing, and Iran and the PRK. So maybe the explanation is just that they need washing machines, which is also why we see Russian soldiers looting washing machines from Ukraine.
But you have these end users who are ordering through regional and local distributors a huge amount of chips, and they're reported to be the people who are using the chips. Do we know what they technically use them for before the diversion happens?
Yeah, they can have very different profiles. Some of them are air conditioner manufacturers. That's specifically for the case of North Korea.
And do we have, or can you share any understanding of what goes on in these air conditioning companies, etc.? Do we have any understanding of what goes on there?
Well, it's difficult to say for sure, but one of the companies we've identified, for example, had previously been identified by the UN panel of experts on North Korea as a company that had been exhibiting in Pyongyang. So they have overt links to the DPRK. We've found also in Chinese media the fact that they had been visited by senior DPRK leadership in the past. So it's not like those companies are trying to hide any kind of links that they might have with the DPRK. On the contrary.
It's just about understanding how they kind of shape shift in order to continue doing that diversion.
Yeah, I don't exactly know what happens. That's why I'm trying to be careful with the word here. These are the companies we found as close as we could to the diversion point. I'm not saying they are the ones who diverted those components, but they are certainly very close to that. In our jargon, we call them last known custodian. They are the last known companies to have had custody of the components that we eventually found in DPRK missiles. So it raises their profile in terms of level of suspicion.
Can you give us an idea of the range of companies?
Well, let's say, in the course of our investigations into the diversion of components to Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, we have identified more than 265 companies that are linked directly or indirectly to the diversion of components that we have identified here in Ukraine in weapon systems that we have opened up. When we identified those companies, 265, they are not sanctioned or listed by the EU or the US. After we report them to the EU and the US, 40%, close to 40% now, have subsequently been listed or sanctioned. So I think that shows also the importance of having a field monitoring components mechanism as part of your export control and sanction mechanism. It's very important not to have this divorce between the realities in the field and how Russia, Iran, or the DPRK will adapt to your sanctions and change the type of components or change the networks of acquisition and your policy making. They will try to adapt. They will try to circumvent sanctions and export control. And it's important to stay one step ahead. And one way to do that is to continue to monitor what type of chips are being used and how they get where they're not supposed to be.
So it's continuing to update the list as you go and identify potential new end users.
One thing we see, for instance, when it comes to Russian weapons is that a lot of those chips are still from before the invasion. So it shows that to a certain extent, they are still relying on stockpiles they've made from before the invasion. And there was a concerted effort on the part of Russia to stockpile components in provision of the invasion to mitigate the effect of sanctions and export control. And that's very important because we hear a lot of stories, that point to the supposed fact that sanctions aren't working because they keep on using Western components. But those stories neglect to look at the date of manufacture of those chips. And very often they are made before 2022. We are starting to see components made after 2022, after sanctions and export control came into effect. And it's very important then to identify the networks of acquisition for those components specifically. I don't think people were thinking about component export control when talking about missile proliferation, especially when you look at the DPRK being under sanction for the last 2 decades. No one was really thinking of talking about components, electronic components, commercial components, as underpinning the whole DPRK missile program, whereas it does. And that's because no one had been able until now to open those missiles and look at what is making them. No components, no missiles. It's as simple as that.
That's super interesting. And so when you say triangulation, you get the batch number of the chips or the identification number of the chips, and you basically go back to the manufacturer and you say, who did you sell that to?
That's the tracing part. The triangulation comes when they go back to us with a list of names, because usually that's how it works. It's not like a unique mark that you find on chips. Like you say, it's a batch number, which will usually identify a week in a year. And in that week, in that year, the producer will say, I sold this very specific model to these 10 customers. And then in turn, these 10 customers sold them to these other customers and whatnot, going down. So we take that information and same reply from, let's say, 20 other manufacturers. And we look at those lists and we see the same names coming back over and over again. And then we look at those companies and see whether they are linked through ownership, through business, to any other entities of interest based in countries of interests, etc. So we do the trade mapping for those companies, looking at specific companies that we know are linked to the batch number that we found ourselves in the weapon that we opened up ourselves. So it's a very hands-on type of approach.
And you said early on in our conversation that a lot of these companies are based in Asian countries. Are you able to tell us a bit more about, are there Asian countries that come back regularly?
Yeah, there's one big Asian country, and it starts with sh and it ends with na.
Okay.
No, of course, China is an issue when it comes to the diversion of components. Companies, not China in itself, but companies based in China, mainland China and Hong Kong. We find a lot of companies based there that are the last known custodians for components that we then find in, Russian, Iranian DPRK weapons. That is the common denominator for chip diversion. We want to be careful with that as well, because we rely on public records and not all countries are as good at reporting trade and things like this. So there are other countries that are problematic as well, and we will have less data on them. So, this all has to be taken with a grain of salt, of course. But the cases that we have, that we've been able to link to chip diversion directly or indirectly, in many, many cases are companies incorporated in China. There's been a lot of focus on manufacturers, which I think is a sunk cost fallacy. And I understand it. Their name is literally on the chip, right? So it's like, oh, why don't you do anything to stop it? But it's very difficult for manufacturers to control the end user of their own product, especially semiconductors. I mean, those stuff are literally everywhere around us. We rely on them every day without even knowing. And they are tiny, very difficult to trace, and made in, trillions in terms of quantity. So, of course, manufacturers will have a hard time. And that's why we're triangulating stuff, and it works. So we're trying to convince now industry to say, look, it works, let's do it together. And, we've identified more than 250 manufacturers in total. But when we look at the responses we get, 60% leads to a top 5 distributors that will have at some point received and sold those components that we find in weapons.
Is there any point in which there's potential prosecution?
So there's been cases of prosecution, especially in the US, where we've been able to assist and support with the work that we're doing. We are certainly providing our information to law enforcement. And I know that some cases have led to prosecution and even people pleading guilty, sentencing, etc. It does support prosecution in some cases. It's really difficult to identify sometimes where a law has been broken, and by whom.
Could we imagine that Ukraine as a country would prosecute those last custodians at one point?
I don't know. I think that there are some cases where some parties have been interested in trying to look into humanitarian law, being broken and things like this, tying cases of weapon systems being used that led to civilian casualties and things like that. That's not really something that we are doing ourselves, but our findings can certainly be used in some cases. Okay. In the cases I know, it's usually a violation of export control rather than humanitarian law at the moment. But commercial semiconductors is usually not something that people tend to associate to this or look into too much when talking about prosecution like that. But more and more it seems to be being thought of, which is good, I think, because again, without components, those things wouldn't fly and wouldn't work.
And so now that there are North Korean troops involved in Ukraine on the ground, do you think the next step of your job is going to be identifying whatever sort of other weapons they use on the ground?
No, I don't think so. I don't know if that would be interesting to see that North Korean troops are using Russian rifles. I think the next step will be for us to look at Iranian missiles if they are being used. So that might be the next step.
We asked the companies listed by the Ukrainian soldier at the press conference on February the 24th about their components being used in Russian missiles. Here are their replies. Intel Altera. We do not do business in Russia, and we operate in strict accordance with export laws, sanctions, and regulations in the US and every jurisdiction in which we operate. We hold our suppliers, customers, and distributors accountable to these same standards. Intel is diligently working to track and mitigate the potential diversion of our products, including actively coordinating with non-governmental organizations, the US, and other governments to identify and stop this activity. Texas Instruments. Texas Instruments strongly opposes the use of our chips in Russian military equipment and the illicit diversion of our products to Russia. We stopped selling products into Russia in February 2022. Any shipments of TI chips into Russia are illicit and unauthorized. TI invests significant time and resources to combat illicit diversion and is committed to continually evolving and improving our efforts. We have a dedicated team that actively and carefully monitors the sale and shipment of our products as part of our robust global trade compliance program. Among other things, this team performs customer due diligence, including performing multiple screens during the order and fulfillment process. If we learn our parts have been diverted to Russia, we conduct an in-depth internal review and take immediate and appropriate action. It is our policy to comply with export control laws. We require our distributors and customers to comply with export control laws and take action if we learn that they do not, up to and including termination. We work with law enforcement and government agencies to support the effectiveness of export controls and to combat the actions of bad actors. Semtech. As a global public company, Semtech is fully committed to and complies with all applicable export controls and economic sanction laws of the countries in which we operate, and requires that its distributors do the same. The company halted shipments of Semtech products to Russia in the wake of the 2022 invasion. Semtech actively monitors its direct and indirect distribution channels and is working with the authorities to counter any unauthorized resale, diversion, or misuse of our products. Canon. The camera believed to have been used is an off-the-shelf product that is widely available for consumer purchase. Unfortunately, we can't control how third parties choose to repurpose or use our devices. Canon EMEA suspended all product deliveries into Russia in March 2022, a measure which is currently still in place. This special episode of Ukraine the Latest was recorded, edited, and produced by Adélie Pojzman-Pontay. The editors were Venetia Rainey and Jack Boswell. The mixing was done by Elliot Lampitt. The executive producers were Louisa Wells and me, David Knowles.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.